Move her, or I'm getting off this plane. The woman's voice cracked through the quiet first-class cabin with the sharp certainty of someone who had never expected to hear the word no. Every conversation stopped. The gentle hum of conditioned air suddenly seemed louder as dozens of eyes turned toward seat 2A, where Danielle Brooks remained perfectly still, one hand resting on a slim leather notebook while the other lightly touched the armrest. She wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal sweater that looked comfortable rather than expensive. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. No designer handbag rested at her feet. No jewelry announced wealth. No assistant hovered nearby. She looked like someone traveling after a long week, not someone who could change the future of the entire flight before the cabin door even closed. The woman standing in the aisle tightened her grip on her boarding pass and shook her head in disbelief. "I said I'm not sitting next to her," she repeated, louder this time, making sure every nearby passenger heard every word. "Find me another seat." A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others looked away, pretending sudden interest in their phones or the safety card tucked inside the seat pocket. No one wanted to become part of the moment, yet no one could ignore it. Danielle slowly lifted her eyes toward the woman. Her expression never changed. She didn't sigh. She didn't argue. She simply waited. That calm seemed to irritate the passenger even more. "Did you hear me?" she demanded while pointing toward Danielle without bothering to lower her voice. "I'm not sitting there." A nearby flight attendant paused halfway down the aisle, sensing trouble before the aircraft had even pushed back from the gate. Outside the window, baggage crews continued loading luggage beneath the bright afternoon sun at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, completely unaware that inside the aircraft a single sentence had already divided the cabin into silent observers and reluctant participants. Danielle had seen this look before. Not the woman's face, but the expression behind it. The quick judgment, the quiet assumption, the belief that appearances explained everything worth knowing about another person. 23 years earlier, she had watched the same expression appear across a conference table when investors questioned whether she belonged in the room. 15 years earlier, she had recognized it inside an executive lounge where security asked for extra identification that no one else had been required to provide. Time had changed her title, her influence, and the number of companies that answered to her decisions. It had never completely erased that look. The flight attendant approached with a practiced smile that struggled to hide growing uncertainty. "Ma'am," she said carefully to the standing passenger, "is there a problem with your assigned seat?" The answer came immediately. Yes, her. The woman didn't say Danielle's name because she didn't know it. She didn't ask a question because she had already decided the answer. She simply pointed again, confident that the airline would solve her discomfort by moving the quiet black woman already seated beside the window. Danielle closed her notebook without a word. The sound of the cover meeting the pages was almost inaudible, yet somehow it carried farther than the raised voices around her. Something had just begun, and before this airplane ever reached the runway, every person inside would discover that the smallest decisions sometimes grounded far more than a flight. The flight attendant offered a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes before looking from the standing passenger to Danielle and back again, searching for the quickest solution instead of the fairest one. Danielle noticed it immediately. Experience had taught her that many people confused convenience with justice. She folded her hands across the notebook resting on her lap and quietly watched the decisions forming around her before anyone had asked a single question about what had actually happened. Across the aisle, a businessman lowered his newspaper just enough to observe without appearing obvious. A young mother seated 2 rows behind gently removed one earbud after realizing the tension was not fading. Even the man loading carry-on bags into the overhead compartment slowed his movements, sensing that something unusual had settled over the front of the cabin. Danielle Brooks had anticipated moments exactly like this. That was why she had boarded wearing clothes that reflected comfort instead of status. She owned tailored suits that cost more than some people's monthly mortgage payments, custom handbags that rarely left their protective cases, and jewelry secured inside vaults rather than closets. None of those things interested her that morning. She wanted to see how ordinary respect survived when wealth was invisible. For nearly 18 months, anonymous customer reports had landed on the desk of Skybridge Holdings after the investment firm completed its controlling acquisition of Horizon Airways. The reports shared a troubling pattern. Travelers described being judged before anyone checked their boarding pass. Some believed they had been treated differently because of their appearance, the clothes they wore, or assumptions people made before learning who they were. Executives presented charts and surveys. Attorneys summarized complaints. Consultants recommended additional training. Danielle read every page, yet numbers never carried the emotional weight of standing inside the moment yourself. That was why she had booked the flight under her real name without notifying anyone inside the airline. No executive welcome. No airport escort. No advance notice to station management. Only one person knew where she was going. Rachel Morgan, her executive assistant, had simply replied to Danielle's message that morning with 4 words. Good luck. Stay observant. Danielle smiled slightly as she remembered it. Rachel understood that the purpose of the trip was not to catch employees making mistakes. It was to discover whether the company's values truly existed once executives disappeared from view. A pair of polished shoes clicked steadily down the aisle as the lead flight attendant approached from the galley with calm professionalism practiced over thousands of flights. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She stopped beside the row and offered the standing passenger an understanding nod before finally acknowledging Danielle. Good afternoon, ladies, she said evenly. Let us see how we can resolve this. Danielle returned a polite smile. There is nothing for me to resolve, she answered softly. Emily paused for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to reveal uncertainty. She turned toward the standing passenger first. Can you tell me what the concern is? The woman crossed her arms. I already did. I refuse to sit there. Emily glanced back toward Danielle, studying her plain sweater, simple sneakers, and quiet posture with an expression that seemed to weigh invisible assumptions. Danielle recognized the hesitation immediately. It was subtle, almost impossible to describe. Yet she had spent decades watching rooms change the moment people believed they understood who belonged and who did not. Outside, the jet bridge remained connected to the aircraft. Inside, every passing second pulled another witness into the unfolding silence, and Danielle could already sense that the real test had not even begun. Emily Carter kept her professional smile in place, but the balance of her attention had already shifted. Instead of asking the standing passenger to return to her assigned seat while the matter was reviewed, she looked directly at Danielle. Would you mind waiting here for just a moment while we explore another seating option? The wording was gentle. The implication was unmistakable. Danielle lifted her eyes with quiet curiosity. My boarding pass assigns me to this seat, she replied evenly. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Emily nodded, yet the answer seemed to complicate rather than clarify the situation. The standing passenger released a frustrated laugh. Why are we making this difficult? Just move her somewhere else. Several nearby travelers exchanged uneasy looks. A man across the aisle lowered his laptop and frowned. An elderly couple seated in the second row whispered to each other, unable to ignore the growing discomfort spreading through the cabin. Danielle remained still, her calm becoming almost unsettling against the rising volume around her. She had learned years ago that composure often exposed prejudice more clearly than confrontation ever could. Emily reached for the cabin phone near the forward galley and quietly spoke to someone out of sight. Less than a minute later, another uniformed crew member appeared. His name tag identified him as Brian Mitchell, the lead service supervisor for the flight. He listened while Emily summarized the situation in careful language that avoided repeating the passenger's actual words. Danielle noticed what had been left out. No one mentioned that she had done absolutely nothing. No one mentioned that the demand had originated from someone refusing to sit beside her. The facts were slowly disappearing beneath the desire to restore comfort as quickly as possible. Brian approached with practiced confidence. Good afternoon, ma'am, he said to Danielle. Perhaps we can relocate you to another premium seat today. Danielle looked toward the empty seat beside her and then back at Brian. Is there something wrong with this one? Brian hesitated. No, ma'am. Then why would I move? She asked quietly. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Brian searched for an answer that sounded reasonable, but every explanation seemed to lead back to the same uncomfortable truth. The standing passenger folded her arms more tightly. Because I am not sitting next to her. That should be enough. A few passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Someone near the bulkhead quietly muttered, "It should not." The words were soft, but Danielle heard them. So did Emily. Yet neither crew member acknowledged the comment. Their attention remained fixed on solving the complaint instead of confronting the reason behind it. Near the front galley, a young flight attendant organizing beverage supplies had stopped working altogether. Her name tag read Mia Thompson. She had joined Horizon Airways less than 6 months earlier and still remembered nearly every detail from orientation. As she watched Danielle's calm expression, something about the woman seemed unexpectedly familiar. Not from television, not from social media, somewhere else. Somewhere connected to the company itself. Mia frowned, searching her memory while Brian continued speaking. We simply want everyone to have a comfortable flight. Danielle answered with the same steady voice that had never risen above normal conversation. Comfort cannot come at the expense of fairness. The sentence settled over the cabin like unexpected turbulence. Even passengers pretending not to listen looked up again. Outside the windows, the ground crew had finished loading luggage, but the aircraft remained parked at the gate with the boarding door still open. Inside, what had begun as one passenger's demand was quietly becoming a test of every person wearing the airline's uniform, and none of them yet realized how much depended on the choice they made next. Mia Thompson could not explain why the woman in seat 2A seemed so familiar, but the feeling refused to disappear. She quietly stepped toward the jump seat near the forward galley where the electronic passenger manifest remained open on a company tablet. She had no intention of invading anyone's privacy. She simply wanted to verify whether memory was playing tricks on her. As she scrolled through the first-class passenger list, one name immediately caught her attention: Danielle Brooks. Her eyes widened for only a second before she carefully lowered the tablet. During new employee orientation, senior leadership had presented a short video introducing the executives behind the airline's parent company. The faces had appeared only briefly, yet one image remained vivid in her mind. Danielle Brooks had spoken for less than 2 minutes about treating every traveler with dignity, because every person carried a story no employee could see. Mia remembered that speech because it had sounded genuine instead of rehearsed. Looking back toward seat 2A, she felt the same quiet presence now sitting only a few yards away. Her heart began beating faster. She glanced toward Emily, then toward Brian, wondering if either of them had recognized the name. Apparently neither had. They remained focused on persuading Danielle to solve a problem she had never created. Across the aisle, another passenger slowly reached for his phone before Danielle gently shook her head. "Please," she said with a calm smile. "Do not record this. Let people choose their words without performing for a camera." The man hesitated before slipping his phone back into his jacket pocket. Her response surprised everyone within earshot. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She wanted the truth to stand on its own. Mia felt a growing knot in her stomach. If this really was the same Danielle Brooks from orientation, then something far more serious than a seating dispute was unfolding. She took a careful step toward Emily and lowered her voice. "I think we should verify the passenger manifest before asking her to move." Emily looked puzzled. "We already know her assignment." Mia nodded. "That is not what I mean." Emily frowned, unable to understand the urgency in the younger attendant's expression. Before Mia could continue, the standing passenger interrupted again. "This is ridiculous. How long does it take to move one person?" Brian answered with the confidence of someone trying to restore order. "We are handling the situation, ma'am." Danielle quietly looked toward him. "No," she said gently. "You are managing the reaction. You have not addressed the cause." Silence followed. Even Brian seemed unsure how to respond. Near the second row, the elderly gentleman who had been quietly observing everything finally spoke. "She has been respectful the entire time," he said. "Perhaps the person refusing to sit should be the one relocated." Several nearby passengers nodded almost instinctively. A young mother added softly, "My children are watching this. They are learning from every decision made here." The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. For the first time, the weight of public opinion no longer rested entirely with the loudest voice. Mia gathered enough courage to step closer to Brian. "Sir," she whispered, "I believe we should contact the gate supervisor before making any further decisions." Brian looked at her with mild impatience. "There is no need to complicate a simple seating issue." Mia swallowed hard. "I do not think this is a simple seating issue anymore." Danielle heard every word without appearing to listen. Her expression remained composed, almost reflective. as though she had already seen this exact moment unfold somewhere else long before anyone else realized where it was leading. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge still connected the cabin to the terminal, but inside, another invisible bridge had begun forming between strangers willing to question what they were witnessing, and with every passing second the certainty that Danielle stood alone quietly began to disappear. Brian took a slow breath before speaking, as though rehearsing the words in his mind before allowing them into the cabin. "Ma'am," he said to Danielle, "if relocating to another seat helps us depart on time, we would appreciate your cooperation." Danielle looked at him with quiet disappointment rather than anger. So the person following the rules is expected to surrender them. Brian shifted his weight, but offered no answer. The standing passenger smiled with visible satisfaction, convinced the discussion was finally ending in her favor. "Exactly," she said. "Now can we please get moving?" The silence that followed felt heavier than any raised voice. Danielle slowly reached beneath the seat in front of her and lifted her small carry-on bag onto her lap. Several passengers watched closely, assuming she had accepted defeat. Even Emily relaxed slightly, believing the confrontation was over. But Danielle did not stand. She simply rested one hand on the suitcase handle while looking through the cabin with calm eyes. The expression on her face carried neither resentment nor embarrassment. It carried recognition. She had lived through this moment before. 25 years earlier, she had boarded a business flight after closing the first major contract of her career. She still remembered the excitement of seeing her name printed on a first-class boarding pass that she had earned through months of impossible work. A flight employee had glanced at her ticket, looked at her face, and quietly suggested there had probably been a mistake. She remembered standing in the aisle while other passengers stared without saying a word. She remembered accepting another seat simply because she was too exhausted to argue. More than the seat itself, she remembered the feeling that her dignity had become negotiable for someone else's comfort. That memory had followed her into every boardroom she later entered. It shaped every hiring policy she approved and every customer standard she demanded from companies carrying her name. Danielle returned to the present as Emily gently reached toward the carry-on bag. "If you would like, I can help relocate your luggage." Danielle's voice remained steady. "Thank you, but I have not agreed to move." Emily withdrew her hand immediately, realizing the assumption she had just made. Across the aisle, the businessman who had quietly observed from the beginning finally closed his laptop. "She has said no 3 times, he remarked calmly. "Why does that answer not matter?" The elderly woman beside him nodded. "You keep asking the wrong person to solve the problem." Their comments spread through the cabin like ripples across still water. More passengers began looking at one another instead of looking away. The young mother gently hugged her daughter closer and whispered something that made the little girl smile before looking back toward Danielle with innocent curiosity rather than fear. Near the galley, Mia could no longer remain silent. She stepped toward Brian again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I recognize her." Brian looked distracted. "Now is not the time." Mia shook her head. "I think this is exactly the time." Before Brian could respond, the gate agent appeared at the aircraft door, asking quietly whether boarding should continue. Emily hesitated for the first time since the incident began. No one answered immediately. The boarding line outside the aircraft slowly stopped moving as confused travelers waited inside the jet bridge. Danielle noticed the delay but remained seated. She did not check her watch. She did not reach for her phone. She simply waited with remarkable patience, allowing every decision to belong completely to the people making it. The standing passenger sighed dramatically. "This is unbelievable," she complained. Danielle finally looked toward her and answered with quiet clarity. "No. What is unbelievable is how quickly fairness becomes negotiable when people assume the wrong person has less power." Those words settled over the first-class cabin with unmistakable weight, and although almost no one understood why they sounded so certain, Mia suddenly did. The realization left her standing perfectly still, knowing that if no one changed course within the next few moments, this flight was about to become unforgettable for reasons none of them had imagined. Brian looked toward Mia with growing impatience, but something in her expression stopped him from dismissing her again. She was not uncertain anymore. She was alarmed. "Sir," she said carefully, "please verify the passenger manifest against the executive directory before making another request." Emily glanced between them, confused by the sudden urgency. Why would we do that? Mia answered quietly. Because I believe we are about to make a very expensive mistake. Brian gave a restrained smile that carried more confidence than caution. This is still a customer service issue. Danielle finally reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed a simple black smartphone. There was no dramatic movement, no expression of frustration. She unlocked the screen, selected a single contact, and waited while the call connected. The standing passenger rolled her eyes. Is she calling customer service now? Danielle did not acknowledge the comment. A calm voice answered almost immediately. Rachel Morgan speaking. Danielle's tone remained as steady as it had been since boarding. Rachel, please activate Protocol 7 for Flight 318. Begin a full executive review before departure. There was no hesitation on the other end. Understood. Initiating Protocol 7 now. Legal, operations control, corporate security, and executive compliance will be notified immediately. Please remain where you are. Danielle replied with only 2 words. Thank you. The call ended. The cabin remained silent for several seconds before the standing passenger laughed softly. That was supposed to scare someone? Brian folded his hands. Ma'am, I appreciate your patience, but I still need to know whether you are willing to relocate. Danielle slipped the phone back into her pocket. No, she answered. I am willing to let your company decide whether this is how it wishes to represent itself. Emily frowned. Our company? Danielle met her eyes. Yes. Near the aircraft door, the gate agent's handheld radio suddenly crackled. He listened for several seconds before looking back toward the flight deck with visible confusion. Another message arrived almost immediately. Then another. He quietly stepped away from the boarding door and answered each transmission with increasing formality. Mia noticed the change before anyone else. The normal rhythm of departure had disappeared. Ramp employees outside paused beside the aircraft instead of disconnecting the ground equipment. 2 airport operations supervisors appeared at the end of the jet bridge, speaking into headsets while looking toward the airplane. Brian frowned. Why has boarding stopped? The gate agent looked up from his radio. Operations just placed the flight on temporary administrative hold. Emily blinked. For weather? No. Maintenance? No explanation yet. Danielle remained seated beside the window, her notebook still resting quietly on her lap. She neither smiled nor celebrated. She simply watched events unfold with the patience of someone who already understood the process. Mia slowly exhaled as the pieces finally aligned in her mind. The orientation video, the name on the manifest, the calm refusal to argue, the single phone call. She looked toward Danielle with a mixture of admiration and concern. Brian noticed the change in Mia's face. What is it? She answered almost in a whisper. I think Protocol 7 was never meant for passengers. Before Brian could ask another question, his company tablet chimed with a priority notification unlike anything he had ever seen during a routine departure. The screen displayed only 4 words before requesting immediate acknowledgement. Executive Incident Response activated. For the first time since the confrontation began, Brian felt complete certainty leave the cabin, replaced by the unmistakable realization that someone far beyond the airport had just begun paying very close attention. Brian stared at the priority notification as if reading it a second time might change the words. It did not. Executive Incident Response activated remained on the screen, followed by a secure request instructing him to keep every passenger seated until further notice. Emily's company phone rang almost immediately. She answered with quiet professionalism, but the color slowly drained from her face as she listened. Yes, she replied. She is still in seat 2A. A long pause followed. Understood. She lowered the phone without speaking. The standing passenger folded her arms impatiently. What is happening now? Emily did not answer. She simply looked toward Danielle with an expression completely different from the one she had worn only minutes earlier. It was no longer confidence. It was uncertainty. At the cockpit door, the captain stepped into the cabin after receiving his own call from operations control. His calm expression carried the unmistakable weight of unexpected instructions. He approached Brian first. Bring me your tablet. Brian handed it over without a word. The captain reviewed the secure message, then looked directly at Danielle before checking the passenger manifest himself. He read the name twice. Danielle Brooks. A second encrypted notification appeared across the screen. Verify identity immediately. Await executive conference. The captain slowly lowered the tablet. Ma'am, he said with measured respect. May I confirm your full name? Danielle nodded. Danielle Brooks. Skybridge Holdings? He asked carefully. Yes. The cabin became perfectly still. Mia quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment, knowing the answer before anyone else. Brian looked back and forth between Danielle and the captain, struggling to understand why a simple name had suddenly changed the atmosphere inside the aircraft. Danielle stood slowly, not to confront anyone, but simply because every person speaking to her remained standing. She adjusted the sleeve of her charcoal sweater and looked around the first-class cabin with remarkable composure. For the last 20 minutes, she said calmly, I have been asked to surrender a seat that I purchased because someone decided they were unwilling to sit beside me. No one interrupted. No one asked me whether I had violated a policy. No one asked whether I had behaved inappropriately. The only proposed solution was to move the person who had followed every rule. The businessman across the aisle quietly nodded. The young mother looked down at her daughter before returning her attention to Danielle. Even the standing passenger no longer spoke. Danielle continued with the same measured voice. You assumed this was only about one seat. It never was. She paused briefly before adding the sentence that seemed to stop time inside the cabin. You asked me to leave a flight operated by a company my organization controls. Brian's eyes widened. Emily covered her mouth instinctively. The captain immediately straightened his posture. His phone rang again. He answered without taking his eyes off Danielle. Captain Reynolds speaking. After listening for several moments, he replied simply, Yes, sir. She is here. Another pause followed before he answered. Understood. We will comply immediately. When the call ended, he faced the cabin with unmistakable seriousness. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced calmly, boarding will remain suspended until further notice. The standing passenger finally found her voice. Wait, who is she? Mia answered before anyone else could. Her voice was respectful but clear enough for every nearby passenger to hear. She is the chief executive officer of Skybridge Holdings, the parent company that controls Horizon Airways. A wave of stunned silence moved through the aircraft. Danielle did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply looked around the cabin and spoke one final sentence. The greatest mistake made here was never failing to recognize my title. It was believing that dignity depends on knowing it. No one moved. The cabin that had been filled with hurried opinions only moments earlier now seemed suspended in complete silence. Even the sounds from outside the aircraft had changed. The baggage carts remained parked. The catering truck had stopped moving. Through the front windows of the terminal, several airport supervisors could be seen walking quickly toward the gate with tablets in their hands and identification badges displayed prominently. Captain Reynolds received another secure message and read it without speaking. He looked toward Brian and Emily before quietly saying, Please surrender your company tablets for temporary review. Neither employee argued. They simply handed over their devices, suddenly aware that this situation had grown far beyond an onboard customer complaint. The standing passenger looked around the cabin with growing confusion. This cannot be happening because of one conversation, she said quietly. Danielle answered with the same calm voice she had maintained since boarding. It is not happening because of one conversation. It is happening because every decision that followed revealed a deeper problem. Her phone vibrated once. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. Danielle accepted the call. Rachel, the Executive Review Committee has completed its initial assessment, Rachel replied. Operations Control has recommended canceling Flight 318. The purpose is to preserve every witness statement, every crew report, and every operational record exactly as they exist. The aircraft will not depart until the investigation is complete. Danielle closed her eyes briefly before answering. Approve the recommendation. Already confirmed, Rachel said. The cancellation notice is being transmitted now. Less than 10 seconds later, every company device inside the aircraft chimed simultaneously. Captain Reynolds looked down at his screen. Flight 318. Status: canceled by Executive Operations. Await further instructions. Emily read the same notification with trembling hands. Brian remained frozen, staring at the words as though they belonged to another flight. The gate agent stepped into the cabin and spoke softly to the captain. Passengers are already receiving cancellation alerts on their phones. Around the cabin, Notification tones began sounding one after another. Travelers looked down at their screens in disbelief before slowly raising their eyes toward Danielle. The businessman across the aisle nodded respectfully. "You did not cancel the flight out of anger," he observed. Danielle shook her head. "No, anger disappears. Culture remains." The elderly gentleman who had spoken earlier smiled gently. "That is a difference many organizations never understand." The standing passenger lowered her eyes for the first time since boarding. She seemed ready to speak, then stopped, realizing there was nothing she could say that would erase what had already happened. Danielle looked toward her without hostility. This was never about punishing you. It became about protecting everyone who flies after you. Airport management entered the aircraft moments later, greeting Captain Reynolds before quietly introducing themselves to Danielle with unmistakable respect. They apologized for the experience and assured her that an independent review would begin immediately. Danielle thanked them politely, but added one condition. "Do not investigate because I was the passenger involved. Investigate because the next traveler may never have the opportunity to make a phone call." Those words settled over every row of the first-class cabin. Mia felt her eyes fill with emotion, not because of Danielle's authority, but because of the restraint with which she had used it. Danielle had never demanded special treatment. She had demanded equal treatment. Outside, the departure board changed from on time to canceled, and inside the aircraft, every person present understood that the real interruption had never been the delayed flight. It had been the quiet moment when fairness was replaced by assumption, and that was the journey Danielle had refused to let the airline continue. Passengers slowly gathered their belongings, but almost no one hurried toward the aircraft door. The usual rush to make connections had been replaced by quiet reflection. Conversations that had once centered on schedules and boarding groups now revolved around respect, fairness, and the uncomfortable realization that assumptions could alter an entire day before anyone noticed the damage they caused. Danielle remained near seat 2A for another moment, looking through the cabin one last time. It appeared exactly as it had when she first boarded, yet everything about it had changed. The seats were the same. The overhead bins remained open. The afternoon sunlight still poured through the windows. The only difference was perspective. Captain Reynolds approached her with sincere professionalism. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology. I allowed urgency to outweigh judgment, and that should never happen under my command." Danielle accepted his words with a small nod. "Thank you for saying that. Accountability begins with honesty." Emily stepped forward next. Her voice was quieter than anyone had heard all afternoon. "I kept searching for the fastest solution instead of the right one. I see that now." Danielle offered a gentle smile. "Then make certain the next passenger never has to teach the same lesson." Brian remained silent for several seconds before finally speaking. "I believed I was protecting the operation." Danielle answered without hesitation. "The operation exists to protect people, not the other way around." Those words settled deeply, and Brian lowered his eyes with genuine understanding. Nearby, Mia watched the exchange with admiration. Danielle turned toward the young flight attendant. "You trusted your instincts when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Never lose that." Mia smiled with visible emotion. "I only remembered what you said during orientation. Every traveler carries a story we cannot see." Danielle nodded. "And today you proved you remembered more than the words." As passengers began leaving the aircraft, several paused beside Danielle. The businessman who had spoken earlier extended his hand. "Thank you for standing your ground." The elderly gentleman added, "You reminded all of us that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is permission." The young mother gently held her daughter's hand as they walked past. The little girl looked up at Danielle and asked, "Were you scared?" Danielle knelt just enough to meet her eyes. Sometimes courage feels exactly like being scared. The important part is choosing kindness anyway. The child smiled before walking toward the jet bridge, carrying a lesson far more valuable than any frequent flyer miles. Airport leaders continued coordinating the investigation, but Danielle did not stay to supervise it. She understood that lasting change would never come from one dramatic meeting or one canceled departure. It would come from thousands of ordinary decisions made differently by ordinary people after today. As she stepped into the jet bridge, Rachel called once more. "Everything is in motion," she said. Danielle looked back briefly at the aircraft resting quietly at the gate. "Good," she replied. Then let the work begin. She ended the call and continued walking without looking back again. Her footsteps echoed softly through the corridor, carrying none of the triumph people often imagined a company's authority. Real leadership had never been about proving how much power she possessed. It had always been about deciding when to use it and why. She had not raised her voice. She had raised the standard. She had not canceled a flight because someone refused to sit beside her. She had stopped a system from moving forward before it carried the same assumptions to someone else with no title, no influence, and no one waiting to answer the phone. Long after Flight 318 disappeared from the departure board, the story people remembered was never about a delayed journey. It was about the quiet moment when dignity refused to change seats, and in doing so reminded everyone that respect is never earned by wealth, appearance, or position. It is revealed by how we choose to treat the stranger sitting beside us.